Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hello.
My name is Harvey Charles, and I'm the Vice Provost for International Affairs here at the University of Minnesota. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this event. And this event, of course, will look at the question, should the United States change its policy towards Taiwan? This event occurs in the best tradition of the university, which is to confront and wrestle with difficult questions of the day, to both educate our students and to advance understanding on the best course of action that we should take as citizens of a democratic society. It would be irresponsible to ignore the fact that the subject of this event is occurring within the context of tensions that currently exist between the United States and China. As such, this subject has implications both for the world's two most powerful nations and economies, but also has ramifications for the lives of everyday Americans. I'm pleased that the China Center, which is part of the Office of Global Programs and Strategy Alliance, is a collaborator with the Brookings Institution for this event. The China Center has a long history of working to facilitate deeper understanding about Chinese history, culture, and contemporary issues of concern on this campus. The China Center works to support student mobility between the University of Minnesota and Chinese partner institutions, as well as to support faculty who are engaged in research collaboration with Chinese counterparts. The China Center also operates within the broader framework of a university community where internationalization and global learning have been strategic priorities and deeply held values. This event, which is sponsored by the Brookings Institution, is part of its long-standing commitment to foster dialogue on critical issues that impact both China and the United States. And so we are pleased to partner with them to bring this important conversation to Minnesota. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to apologize, or at least acknowledge the fact that we've had to change venue. And we appreciate the effort you made to kind of pivot at very last notice and come to this location. I'd also like to acknowledge the many staff at GPS Alliance who literally threw their bodies into action to get this room ready in less than 2 hours notice. So thank you for your willingness to do what was required to make this all possible. And now, some information about our distinguished panelists and the moderator. I'd first like to introduce Rory Daniels, who is the Managing Director of Asia Society Policy Institute, where she leads and oversees strategy and operations for ASPI's projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. She's also a senior fellow with ASPI's Center for China Analysis. Then Thomas Hansen, who is a former US Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, who worked on the Foreign Relations Committees of the US Senate and House of Representatives. He's currently diplomat in residence at the Allworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Ivan Kanapathy is a senior vice president with Beacon Global Strategies. He previously served on the White House's National Security Council staff as director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and Deputy Senior Director for Asian Affairs. Next, we have Michael O'Hanlon, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in US defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He directs the Strobe Talbot Center on Security, Strategy, and Technology, as well as the Defense Industrial Base Working Group. And finally, our very own John Raj, the moderator, who is an editorial writer and columnist at the Star Tribune. His focus is on foreign policy. His focus on foreign policy is taking him on international reporting trips to China, Japan, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Lithuania, Kuwait, and Canada. A round of applause to our panelists and Welcome again to this event, and thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation, and thank you all very much for being here today. You know, I think that everyone in this room is in some form or fashion a practitioner of foreign policy. And perhaps with everything happening around the world right now, you've wondered whether the issue of US policy towards Taiwan is going to get pushed off the stage. And I meant metaphorically, not literally, but of course it literally got pushed off the stage today in terms of the protests as we're aware of regarding the war in Gaza, which made this change in venue necessary. And so as we we're talking a little bit before we began the panel here, we're thinking about the audience and you know, how many people would be here and the depth of knowledge and the fact that, first of all, people were motivated to come and then motivated enough to go with the change of venue. I'm quite anticipating that there will be a lot of terrific questions. So we're going to leave some time at the end for that because we really welcome your participation in the conversation. First, as most of you probably know, and hopefully many of you have probably read, and indeed if you have not, after the event on Brookings Institute as well as the China Center's website, there are terrifically well thought and thorough theses from all of the panelists in terms of this key question that we're going to examine here today. So what we're going to do in order, and we won't do this for every question, but certainly at the beginning here, is have each of the panelists share a concise version of what they wrote. And as you do go access that, you'll also realize that they have responded to what each other wrote, which is of course the spirit of what we're going to try to do here on the panel as well. So I'll start with you, Rory. Thanks for being here and please share your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mr. Brookings. Thanks to the University of Minnesota, the China Center, all of you for coming to hear me talk about my favorite subject, which is policy on Taiwan. Because I have the privilege and the honor of speaking first, just because of our seating arrangements, not a judgment on the quality of all the writing that my panelists have done, which is excellent. I'd like to start by just explaining what US policy currently is towards Taiwan and how we came to be here. So as a scene setter, I would define the core of US policy toward Taiwan as neutrality on the issue of Taiwan's sovereignty. So when the United States switched formal diplomatic recognition of the capital of China from Taipei to Beijing in 1979, Taiwan entered this unambiguous, unofficial relationship with the United States, one that was still, I argue, very important to understanding US priorities and interests in Asia. Again, the core of the US policy is that we don't take a position on the sovereignty of Taiwan. China, Beijing, the People's Republic of China, claims Taiwan as part of its territory. But we neither recognize that claim over Taiwan, nor do we consider our relationship with Taiwan to be separate from our relationship with China. We leave it ambiguous. And that ambiguity has allowed for a great deal of policy flexibility over the years to maintain Taiwan's autonomy in the international system, even though Taiwan has very, very few formal diplomatic allies. So Taiwan continues as an autonomous entity to have its own government, its own military, its own foreign affairs, its own economic relationships with with countries around the world. And so, you know, US policy, and we can talk more about the nuances and different pieces of it, has been we don't take a position on the sovereignty of Taiwan, but we do want this issue resolved through dialogue between the two sides of the strait and without the use of force or coercion. And that policy has been successful because it allows us to focus on what is, I think, most critically important to American interests, which is peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, that the issue is resolved peacefully, that it is not resolved through military actions, that it is not coerced through military actions, And the challenge, I think, that all of us would agree on is that as the People's Republic of China has become more economically strong, it has also modernized and expanded its military power. It is often used, its combined economic and military power, to coerce countries into taking political positions that Beijing favors that are sometimes contrary to the interests of those other countries. And we could go through any number of situations where that has occurred. At this moment in US policy toward Taiwan, the big strategic question that the policy community is dealing with is, should we continue to be ambiguous about what we mean when we say we do not want to see the use of force or coercion? Should we commit to defending Taiwan in the case of an attack, a military attack from China, or a significant use of coercion and blockade, other scenarios that could be envisaged that would constitute a military threat to Taiwan? I argue that we should not, that in fact, seeking the absolute security of Taiwan, trying to use US military power to create symmetry in the military relationship between a combined US-Taiwan on one side and China on the other, will deepen what has already become a security dilemma in which the actions that one side takes, the US and Taiwan, for example, in defense of Taiwan are perceived by the other side as offensive and escalatory in nature. China sees US-Taiwan relationship strengthening, sees a US commitment to defend Taiwan in case of an attack, and immediately ratchets up pressure on Taiwan to try to defend its own interests, that Taiwan does not declare independence. And so I fundamentally believe that Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan, the sovereignty of Taiwan, the eventual settlement of the Taiwan issue is a political problem. It is not a military problem. And if we start coming to the table with a military solution for this political problem, we shift the conversation into what would militarily be necessary to defend or take over Taiwan. So the US thinks only in terms of military defense of Taiwan. The PRC, the People's Republic of China, only thinks, well, what do I have to do now that this is a military problem to counteract US military pressure or to outpace US military development and modernization? And we, at the same time, discount all of the political signaling that creates more tension in the Taiwan Strait. So, if we look back over the last several Taiwan Strait crises, you will see that they were not sparked by a military action. They were almost always sparked by political dynamics. It is Taiwan's then President Lee Teng-hui coming to the United States and giving a big speech that Beijing felt was an overstep of the unofficial relationship that caused a Taiwan Strait crisis in the 1990s. Much more recently, maybe closer to home, it was Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island in 2021 that sparked military exercises in the Taiwan Strait that were escalating into a crisis. So I think we should stay firmly focused on political strategies to defend Taiwan. And I think that we should not try to create symmetry in the military balance. It's unachievable. I believe it is unachievable to create symmetry in the military balance. But what is achievable is to help Taiwan develop its economic and social relationships with countries around the world, economic relationships it already has. It has free trade agreements with many other economic entities, zones, countries. And I think through the use of internationalizing Taiwan's exposure to the world, it raised the stakes and complicates the decision to use force to take Taiwan from Beijing's perspective. They simply don't know what the ramifications of all of those different relationships and how they would play out would be. So I apologize for going on a little bit longer than needed, but I did want to lay out kind of big picture where we are and how we came to be here, and look forward to my fellow panelists filling in all of the gaps, details, and correcting me when I misspoke.
Certainly no apologies needed, and I think that was helpful for all of us. So a lot of themes we'll try to return to. But Michael, why don't you please share your perspective and a version of what you.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. That was brilliant, Rory. Thank you for framing so well. Only one tiny detail that there's nothing to correct about your analysis. Ryan and I were in the same hotel that Nancy Pelosi had stayed in August of 2022.
Thank you.
The week later. But one thing that was interesting that people will find, I'm sure some of you have been to Taiwan, but it's an amazing place. And you couldn't tell, nobody was in a bad mood because the Chinese were firing missiles off their shore. We had to be restrained because it was the latest outbreak of COVID, and we were ushered in and out by the freight elevator because we weren't allowed to interact with people for the first 5 days we were there. But otherwise, when we were out on the street, it was bustling and it was fun. It's just an amazing place. And they should keep what they got. It's good. It's great. And I think we all admire and like Taiwan. I'm basically with Rory, though, on thinking the best way to preserve that is to keep policy steady. At least the broad framing of one China policy. Now, it's not a one China principle. As Rory said, we don't insist that these countries or these entities be reunified. That's Beijing's view. It's not necessarily our view. But we do have a policy of saying we just don't want war. Whatever the two parties can decide that would lead to either a change or the status quo without war is good by us. There are American strategists these days who are saying they want to change that because Taiwan's become so important with semiconductors or as sort of the first key island out into the Pacific, that if China ever controlled Taiwan, it would be really bad for us. You know, that may be true, but that's a reason to diversify semiconductor production. It's not a reason to force the issue or to insist that Taiwan be independent. I think a lot of you know the history of the so-called one China policy. Initially, as Rory said, we wanted to sort of, we switched our allegiances in a sense, but we always kept our allegiance to Taiwan. We tried to break China off from the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So we were trying to have good relations with both China and Taiwan. We also wanted to deter China from attacking Taiwan, but we wanted to deter Taiwan from pursuing independence unilaterally because that could provoke the very war that we most wanted to avoid. And then as the years went by, we just saw this policy was so established that trying to disrupt it would itself be disruptive and, you know, prone towards escalatory reactions. So I think those are some of the reasons why we wind up with this ongoing policy that some people call strategic ambiguity, but the more polite term is really dual deterrence, where we're trying to deter China from attacking Taiwan, trying to deter Taiwan from unilaterally and maybe even recklessly pursuing independence. Well, Ryan and I were there, and he's been there subsequently, but we met with Vice President Lai, who's about to be inaugurated as the new president of Taiwan, and has a history of advocating for independence. He seemed to be on his relatively better behavior in our company. And I've heard that he, in recent years, has been a little more restrained in how much he talks about independence. I certainly hope that's the way he governs. Otherwise, we could all be in trouble. One thing that I've tried to do in my country, I don't know China as well as most of the people on this panel, but I certainly, as a defense analyst, I'm aware of its importance. And I tried to do a paper a couple of years ago which I actually gave to President Tsai on our trip. I hope she didn't consider it impolite, because I tried to argue in the paper, if there is war between China and the United States over Taiwan, that I don't know who wins. And I did as detailed of a military analysis as I know how to do, and especially if China tries to undertake a blockade, I don't think we can feel any guarantee that we would win that war, which is much different than how things used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, the Chinese have obviously been good fighters on the ground forever, and we stalemated with them in the Korean War in the 1950s. But back then, the Chinese could never have gone toe-to-toe with us in a maritime or air-to-air or combined encounter around Taiwan. Today, they probably can. And again, I don't know how to predict who would win, which is one more good reason not to run the experiment, not to push our luck. I'll finish by saying there's only one aspect to our policy that I think we should reconsider, and it's more of a nuance. It's more of a clarification than it is a change. But we have, as a government, said for 40 years that if there were war between China and Taiwan, we don't know if we get involved. We would assess how it started, what we thought were the dynamics, what we thought was the most productive way for the United States to be engaged and involved, and then we would decide. And I still would stand by that approach. But I would like to tell Beijing, if you ever attack Taiwan, our relationship will never be the same. And I give credit, by the way, to Ivan and some of the things done in the Trump years, which have been sustained in the Biden years, for getting tougher on China in regard to a number of economic areas. But as we all know, even though there have been some limitations on technology transfer and some tariffs and some pushback against Chinese theft of intellectual property, we still have a very big economic relationship with China. And for me, that's fine right now. But if China attacked Taiwan, China should know that relationship goes away. Or at least we are going to work as hard as we can, not just to quote unquote de-risk our policy towards China, but to decouple, the word they don't like right now, but that what I think have to become the reality. If China attacks Taiwan, whether we respond militarily or not, our broader economic and diplomatic relationships could never be the same, and China should know that, and that should be stated clearly. On that point, I think it's sort of obvious already, but I think you might as well be explicit and clear. So that's the one tweak that I would propose for our current policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And we'll turn to some of those military themes, but we'll hear from Tom Hansen now.
Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Rory. You do great presentations. I'll just add a few points here. I agree with what Rory said about the fact that we're in a security dilemma. There's a lack of trust between Beijing and Washington. Meeting intent, thinking policies of each other, that actually worsening the situation. You know, China's rise has now gotten to the point where it's having political and military effects. And China is embarked on a geoeconomic strategy very broadly, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS developing with more and more members. This is largely a political and diplomatic economic strategy that they're following. The military threat and the military potential crisis is in the Pacific, and it's around Taiwan. So this issue is at the heart of the relationship, and the danger exists that we sleepwalk into a war. These are two nuclear powers. So I'll just start by saying that we have to approach this very, very carefully, in my view. I have to put the Taiwan issue in two contexts. First of all, obviously, the United States is responding to China's rise, and how we respond is going to be very important going forward. How this evolves. I think the turning point was reached in 2008, 2007, 2008 with the economic crisis. I think to a certain extent, the US began to lose confidence with the crisis in 2008. I think we really had felt that time was on our side, the responsible stakeholder outlook, the paradigm that we used to shape our policy. Suddenly people began to think, well, time might be on China's side. And that was, I think, what motivated the pivot. It took place during Obama's administration. It's of note that the architect, conceptual, in my view, of that pivot was Kurt Campbell, who was currently the Deputy Secretary of State. And so there's a certain amount of continuity in that pivot. Now, initially, we took some military steps. We tried to get a Trans-Pacific Partnership going. But when both Trump and Hillary Clinton disavowed the TPP, the economic dimension of our pivot began to fade. And ever since, we're really relying more on sanctions and on a military build in the Pacific. Ivan has pointed out that in the Obama administration, as we began this pivot, we were careful on Taiwan. The Obama team did not, nor did George W. Bush, really sort of extend our commitment or the profile that we gave to the Taiwan issue. That began to change with Donald Trump, who, at least in terms of our verbal policy, public policy, was forward-leaning toward Taiwan. And that represented a shift. But the big shift is happening now under the Biden administration, which is a very organized administration, which is building upon something that started long ago with many of the same advisors, and is focused on bloc building, alliance building, specific military alliance building in Asia around China. They're being very effective at this. The alliance management is being undertaken by the Biden team is very impressive. Diplomacy, I think we can discuss that. But in terms of alliances, yes. And so whether it's reinvigorating the Quad, US, India, Australia, and Japan. The AUKUS agreement, Jake Sullivan, Southwest High School in the Twin Cities, as National Security Advisor has said, quote, if Ronald Reagan's formula was peace through strength, Joe Biden's formula is peace through American and allied strength. President Biden has talked about and feels very strongly about connecting our allies in the Atlantic with our allies in the Pacific. So there's this dimension that's evolving too, in terms of our assertion in Asia. Now, what troubles me is that right from the start of this administration, we began to weave Taiwan into this military bloc building, military presence in Asia in a way that we had not done before. And I'll take as an example of this, a statement by Eli Ratner, who is very credible. He was deputy head of Biden's national security team when he was vice president. He is now the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and he said, quote, in Senate testimony, Taiwan today is a critical node within the first island chain, anchoring a network of US allies and partners that is critical to the region's security and critical to the defense of vital US interests in the Indo-Pacific. So, to my mind, you can discuss the overall policy in Asia of alliance building with a lot recommended. But whether we should leave an issue like Taiwan, which is so emotional, especially to the Chinese side, to me, it strikes me as system overload to a certain extent. And I think to the extent that we really do need confidence building, trust building, Taiwan would be a good place to start in this larger matrix, and especially, as Rory has said, to adhere to the strategic ambiguity that has been the cornerstone of the relationship since the early 1970s. Now, the second, and very briefly, context I would give is this. The security and threat environment today is very different from the threat environment of the Cold War. There are a panoply of new threats, of global shared threats that cannot be met by any individual country or fragmentary alliance that are going to require cooperation especially between the United States and China. And so to my mind, for this reason too, we need diplomacy and trust building in spite of the military tensions in this larger context of global threats that urgently require US-China cooperation. So I'll just conclude by saying I'm all for a steady policy, but our system is not built that way. It's an invitation to struggle. Congress has a big role. Our administration says they change with each new election. Oftentimes there is big changes. The Chinese complain that our words and our actions do not match. And a fine example is the United Policies trip, which was proposed by the Biden administration. This is the same political party. And the Biden team could not convince Nancy Pelosi not to go at that juncture. And of course, that's what ended fentanyl cooperation for a time, climate. Anyway, so it's going to be tough for us to have a steady policy in the region that will assure peace and the development of both our countries in cooperating with each other. So that's just on that item.
Thank you very much, and very many compelling points, I think, in particular among them on TPP, which was often viewed as an economic and thus a political issue here, wasn't looked at as a foreign policy issue nearly as much, including by the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. So, seem to bring that up as well. I would love to hear your perspective.
Great, thanks so much, John and Tommy. Thanks, Dr. Charles University, Ryan, and your team over at Brookings. It's really great to be here. I'll start out that we probably won't debate on one point, which is the strategic ambiguity problem. I don't have really any bones to pick with what anyone said on that. I agree. I actually think it's a little bit of a moot question, to be honest, because I think Beijing, and the US government's assessment, I think it's similar to mine. Beijing believes we're gonna intervene So, we could say it or we could not say, and to some degree, I obviously agree with what Mike said about the economic, make sure they understand the consequences, how the relationship's gonna break down. Not only a military response, but if they assume we're gonna intervene militarily, I'm sure, or I would assume, they also assume that economic relations are gonna really crumble. We're gonna make that decision with all that in mind, and so far, that's held. And I mean that, I guess to touch a little bit on what Rory said earlier, I don't like to overstate, or I don't think we should overstate what the one China policy, China, one China principle, but sort of what this policy accommodation has done for us, how successful it's been in preserving peace. I think sometimes we confuse correlation with causation. We have to be careful about that because, my understanding, and I think most folks, is that China cannot take Taiwan. And there's just data out there people throw around. By 2027, Xi Jinping wants the PLA to be able to do it. And so for most of the time, the past few decades, until very recently, I don't think it was even a remote option, right, until the last few years. And so the idea that something else was needed to preserve peace is, I think, just, a bit, I don't know, Kissinger telling himself what he wanted to hear, right, and telling the rest of us, may you rest in peace. No, I mean, obviously a great statement, but I think a lot of that, over the years, we needed to kind of really look at the military aspects, and I appreciate, I guess one aspect what Rory said is we don't want military symmetry. I think she said it, but the way I see it is we have had an asymmetric advantage for a long, long time. And to me, more than the one China policy, that's what's preserved peace. And what we want is to maintain a undeniable military advantage, overmatch, because then an adversary doesn't try to do something, right? I mean, it's when we become symmetric and closer that we start to lose that. That's where the uncertainty comes in. When somebody thinks that they can do something and win, but maybe we also think we're gonna win, man, you look at history, that's how wars start. So I'd much rather us sort of invest and maintain that overmatch as a way of, again, deterring and preventing that thing that we all don't want to see. But I agree very much with the other three that, there's a lot of flexibility in our one China policy as we've executed over the years. And, I put a couple things in a paper that I'll mention real briefly on some shifts we could make within that flexibility. I don't think, I agree with everybody here. I don't think there's any need to change the overall framework whatsoever. I've mentioned the military deterrence. A second thing is that I've seen in recent years, the US has tended to lean into one aspect of our policy, which is to articulate that we do not support Taiwan independence, which is part of the policy, has been since at least the 1990s. But at various times, we've emphasized that or de-emphasized that element. In the Bush administration, the more recent one, I think we used it a lot because we were quite worried about the direction that particular leader in Taiwan was going in 2000 to 2008. And we used it as a way to approach him, right? To ask him to back off. And I think that we're at a place now where, while we may have some worries about Taiwan, I would believe that most of our worries about destabilizing the status quo come from Beijing. And so it's not helpful to sort of emphasize those parts of our policy. It might be better, if we need to anyway, to just say, which is again part of the policy, is we oppose unilateral changes to the status quo, which then also implicates China, because there are things that China would do in the status quo that we would certainly find, again, destabilizing. And then finally, the last thing that I would propose or suggest, and again, these are sort of just shifts, not so much policy changes, but shifts in the way we talk about things, is maybe less often we could refer to it as the one China policy. because the one China policy can be quite confusing. And it actually leaves an opening that CRC propaganda takes advantage of very often. And it's not just the United States. The United States has this policy, as Rory stated very clearly, that we don't take a position on sovereignty of Taiwan. China's one kind of principle absolutely takes a position on the sovereignty of Taiwan. It says explicitly, Taiwan is a part of China, you know, and of course, they're the legitimate government of that. And so the policies are different, ours and China's. It's not just the United States, though. All of our allies and partners also, you know, our version says we acknowledge the Chinese position, XYZ. A lot of countries say we respect the Chinese position, or we take note of China's claim. But very few of our allies, Europe, Japan, I'm talking Australia, Philippines, very few, if any, actually come out and say, we believe Taiwan is part of China, or that's our position. And so I think the United States could take the lead here, and as it has done on other things with Taiwan, peace and stability and common trade, and kind of clarify a bit more. And one way would be to kind of just call it a cross-strait policy and be a little clearer about what we mean. But I'll pause there and let John take it back for discussion.
Ivan, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for sharing some of your perspectives, which again are the documents, you know, that were submitted as part of this panel here. And I'm going to turn to a series of questions. By the way, there are mics in the ceiling, so when we get to Q&A, maybe don't speak this loud, but I'm trying to project here so it gets picked up, but we'll continue to pass this around as well. But I'm going to ask a series of questions that not everyone will respond to. I'll turn to a few of the panelists on each of them so we can get through a lot of top topics regarding Taiwan here. Rory, I'll start with you. And Ivan was just mentioning in that he said, in effect, that Beijing believes that the U.S. will intervene if indeed something happens militarily. And so it begs the question, to the degree that President Joe Biden, you know, has he already, to some effect, answered the question in what we're hearing? And on 4 different occasions within his administration so far, he has said that the U.S. would militarily respond if, quote, there was an unprecedented attack on the island. Now, he hasn't defined what unprecedented attack means at this point, but, you know, if the president does that once, it might be a miscommunication. Twice, there were gaffes, and in each time, his staff has tried to walk back the comments, but he keeps coming back to him. It's now happened 4 times. So, in effect, has this policy already changed?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. So we're into some complex diplomatic maneuvering now, right? You know, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. He is also the commander-in-chief of the United States forces. And it's my interpretation of his comments that he made them in his capacity as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, thinking about a military situation, rather than as official policy of the United States, that we would come to, you know, Taiwan's defense in any situation, in a very specific situation. So has the policy changed? I think some of the walking back you see implies that it has not, that we don't have a blanket policy to intervene on behalf of Taiwan in any military contingency. But this president certainly feels, and I think, you know, feels from the position of deterrence, that it's important to make those statements, that the U.S. does think at this point it would be prudent and wise to intervene. You know, I think that perhaps what we have not completely laid out, that I think all of us would agree on, is the catastrophe it would be for this to come to pass. You can look at the stats, but people estimate anywhere between 60 and 85% of global shipping passes through the Taiwan Strait, and in and around Taiwan. We talk about having a hard economic response to China. That would have an immediate devastating effect on your lives, on the economy of the United States of America. You would not be able to buy things. we would not have supply chains. Like, this is a disaster. So I think that, you know, not to kind of take away from the importance of, you know, the president giving very specific and clear guidance on what would happen right now in the event of an attack. The overall US policy remains ambiguous because we know that this will be a complete and total disaster. It's contrary to the interests of the American people to have the conflict happen in the first place. And what everyone in the US, in Taiwan, and I think many people in Beijing and in China are trying to do is figure out how to avoid that eventuality, not how to.
Michael, please jump in.
That was a great answer, Rory, and I just wanted to emphasize, yes, it would be a complete disaster, perhaps on a scale of the world wars. And you know what the United States did when it entered the world wars? It declared war. Congress had a role. So I just want to back up and reinforce Rory's point, distinguishing, and I hadn't heard it put that way, but it's a very smart way to put it, distinguishing between Joe Biden's almost personal view, or at least his view as the head of the executive branch, versus what the Constitution of the United States requires to do something as momentous as go to war against China. Now, if there were an acute threat and China's loading up amphibious assault ships, and there's only, you know, Congress is out of town, you could argue there may not be time for the initial response to be approved by Congress. But this is a situation where Congress should have a role, either in declaring war or in authorizing war, which of course has been the more modern variant. We haven't declared war formally since 1942, but we have authorized both Iraq wars. Actually, Republicans have been better at this than Democrats, asking, and I'm a Democrat, asking for permission from Congress in the modern era. But at a minimum, we should do that. And we shouldn't just let a president decide because of how he happens to feel at a podium, whether it's Biden, Trump, Bush, Obama, or anybody else.
Thanks very much. Tom, jump in, please.
I couldn't agree more on the necessity of avoiding a nuclear conflict. You know, we all was old enough to remember how central the nuclear threat was in popular culture. It's no longer the case, and I'm worried that the awareness of the nuclear threat is diminishing. I think it's diminishing in our country. Actually, you know, and if you look at Ukraine, in the first year of the war, in explaining why we weren't sending things like ATACMS to Ukraine, Jake Sullivan said, "We don't want to start World War III." And he was roundly attacked by people in the Atlantic Council, other think tanks in DC, saying, "What do you mean? What do you mean? You did this." I think the threshold is shifting on the willingness to envisage nuclear conflict. And I just hope that that does not apply also to the situation in Asia. And I might also add, when it comes to Ukraine, we've been building up the Ukrainians since 2014, but with no intention of getting NATO directly involved in a conflict. On Taiwan, we're basically saying, you know, we'll come in directly against Beijing in this scenario. It's different from what we're saying on Taiwan vis-a-vis Russia. So anyway, I'm just a little concerned that the issue is shifting.
I think that's a really good point, Tom, at the end, because my sense, just talking to folks close to the administration, is that I think President Biden, you know this, but really felt that, you know, there was we all know there was a deterrence failure in February of 2022. And one of the things that President Biden had said before that was, I am not going to involve US troops in this. I think his instinct when asked about Taiwan, at least the first one or two times, was, I don't want to make that mistake again with Xi Jinping. You know, I think whether it was intentional or not, they kind of eventually sort of stumbled into a not bad sort of exquisite place where, you know, I would not advocate, I agree with Rory, that there's any kind of formal declaration, treaty, sort of where Biden is. I think his intent was to maintain that dual deterrence. I think probably has.
You know, I'm on that. I'll turn to you because beyond your foreign policy expertise, you of course, as was mentioned, part of the congressional and Senate staff. And since the analyses were published, as we all know, last Saturday, the U.S. House finally passed foreign aid bills, and the Senate seconded it this week, and the Biden administration is going to indeed do just that, is administer this. Taiwan, of course, was one of these. and proved the highest vote getter, which would suggest a consensus regarding the rise of China and the threat to Taiwan that was stronger than the consensus they were able to cobble together regarding Ukraine and Israel. So on that, Tom, to what degree might that play out in policy? To what degree does that potentially, send a signal to Beijing that they might overinterpret? To what degree does it, at worst, lead to groupthink in terms of, how everyone is perhaps overlooking some of the threats that the four of you have so well spelled out here within your analysis and on the stage?
If there's one issue that both sides of our very polarized polity agree on, it's China. Now, the reasons for that, it's hard to know. I think there's I don't want to call it enemy deprivation syndrome, but when you're very polarized, it's convenient to have something that galvanizes and brings together. And I think China is filling that role right now. Now, the amount that was given to Taiwan, of course, was minuscule compared to the other, to Israel and to Ukraine. But you're right, there's much more support for that. I'm a little concerned though, because what I discern in the Republican Party right now, and I think it probably could even apply to Taiwan eventually. And this is not just Trump. There's a return to the Taft Republican tradition. At the end of World War II, there was a sizable chunk of the Republican Party that opposed NATO. And this was Taft, it was Hoover, who was still alive. And the reason for doing so was that alliances like that would create a large government. Right? They linked it to the big government problem. Of course, we have had a much bigger government since. When I look at what the Heritage Foundation is doing right now with Project 2025 and Schedule F and plans to just radically reduce the US bureaucracy, we're talking hundreds of thousands potentially. I tie that together with the sort of skepticism toward NATO that also exists in that part of the Republican Party. And as I say, I think it goes beyond Trump. And I'm just concerned, I just hope that that doesn't develop further, because I think it could eventually impact even policies in Asia.
Michael, from a defense production perspective, to what degree do these three new aid bills and what had been previously committed, is there a capacity challenge? And something I'm sure that Beijing is tracking as closely as publicly available information is out there. And to what degree might that become a factor in how this plays out?
Thank you, and I'm sure Ivan, a Top Gun pilot, by the way, will have some things he might want to say on this as well. But I would just draw out a couple of points, and he and I have both made mention of the military balance as it exists today, which is of course the baseline. So how fast you can produce is, only meaningful relative to a baseline you need to change. And I agree with Ivan's point that historically, China has not really had plausible invasion capability of Taiwan. And even today, it's questionable because the amphibious assault is extremely difficult. It was very hard for us in World War II. Since World War II, we've had the development of precision missiles and other sensors that allow people to see big ships coming and put ordnance against them very, very reliably. You can try, if you're the attacker, to jam those systems to defend against those missiles, but it's very hard. So I think that China may have a greater capacity now to attempt this, but it would still be a long shot and would, I think, be quite foolish. However, if you shift the military scenario to a blockade, which could be, by the way, instituted gradually, it doesn't have to be just declared and quarantined on day one, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It could be applied more gingerly, sort of a stepped up version of what they did in August 2022 with the missiles. But then you start to have one or two missiles land in port or even hit a crane or otherwise make shipping companies not want to go into Taiwan the same way the Houthi rebels have discouraged the world from using the Red Sea. That's a much easier thing for China to do. It puts many fewer of their own assets at risk, and it allows them to dial it back if they decide the world is reacting more strongly than they expected. So In this scenario, we're the ones that have to protect our big surface ships and airfields as they try to enforce and protect a maritime protection zone or, a shipping channel that would be impervious to Chinese attack. The Chinese would only have to sink or attack the occasional ship to create the same kind of effect on steroids that the Houthis have created more recently in the Red Sea. So on that one, I think we have a big dilemma on our hands. We might be able to help Taiwan survive, literally survive in terms of food and medicine, but even that's going to be hard. There's no way we can protect their economy at the current functioning if China really puts its mind to a blockade. And I don't know how to predict the winner, as I said before, in that scenario. Even if we then ramp up our defense industrial base and we have 50% more ships than we have today, based on the calculations that I've tried to do, which are admittedly imperfect, but there's no guarantee even in that world that we win. So I'll give the microphone to Ivan here and he may want to comment, but my point is the blockade scenario is a really, really nettlesome one. And we get into that, even if it doesn't escalate to nuclear war, even if it doesn't, even if it just stays within those geographic and military confines, it's still hard for me to know who's going to win, regardless of how fast we can produce more ships, more anti-missile interceptors and submarines. So I guess I'm sort of punting on your question, John, to argue that strategically, I think we can produce pretty well. We're not going to do what we did in World War II and just turn things around in 12 months. We don't have that kind of industrial base anymore. And modern defense technology is much different. But I think we can do pretty well to the point where China's not going to feel confident it could win, but we're also not going to be confident that we would win.
Well, let's turn to our Top Gun pilot here and how many. Also, I'm just gonna, please, if you would add, Tom pointed out very well in the written analysis that nowhere in any of your comments was the word porcupine mentioned. And for those of you, of course, who followed this debate, that's often invoked on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, is to, in effect, have Taiwan like a porcupine, like quills, where it cannot be attacked and where, and that would deter Beijing. None of you mentioned that, and he mentioned that no one had mentioned that. Comment on that, the dearth of that term, and if the term is too oversimplified or.
I actually am a fan of the porcupine strategy, which, to get, and what that means, there are real debates, in Washington, as Mike knows well, and others here, on what the best way to deter is, right, to Taiwan. And, there are different scenarios, gray zone stuff, the blockades, the invasion. I tend to believe that the invasion is the one that militarily we should focus on. I think a blockade is legitimate. I believe that we should sort of, as a global allies, kind of turn to economic means to handle that one as best we can. Because as Mike pointed out, it's a really tough military problem. I also think that Xi Jinping is less likely to lean toward blockade for similar reasons, because the outcome may not be what he wants, in other words, control of Taiwan, right? But that leaves then militarily, I do believe the porcupine, which is really closer in weapons, even like not super long range things that Taiwan needs. I mean, we're talking, well, now since 2022, we all know what stingers and javelins are, right? That initial invasion happened. And basically Ukraine was able to repel, and I think of like Kyiv as Taiwan. So not Ukraine as Taiwan, but Kyiv was able to repel, this invasion force. If Taiwan could think of itself that way, I think that is a cost-effective way to handle sort of a much more well-resourced adversary.
Thank you. Rory, I know you've given this a lot of thought as well, and so if you want to jump in, including, the semiconductor, manufacturing was also mentioned. So if you have any thoughts in terms of how that's playing out in this debate with the CHIPS Act and other actions that the administration is.
Sure. Let me try to marry all my thoughts together then. I think what we have here is, I think we spent a lot of time talking about specific scenarios related to Beijing's capabilities, its military capabilities. And that is certainly important, and there's a role for planning for that, but there's also Beijing's intentions. And I think that because policymakers are working with imperfect information and intentions aren't always clear, we tend to look for worst case intentions, maybe when they are not there. I've been working on the Taiwan issue for about 15 years. I've spent thousands of hours in conversations with Chinese academics, scholars, officials on this issue. And I really fundamentally would like to revisit the premise that the only thing holding back Beijing from invading Taiwan is US military superiority. I think it matters to Beijing how this conflict gets solved. It is not one that they feel they need to go in and crush Taiwan. It is not Russia, Ukraine. This is really, there is an art to how Beijing thinks this issue should be settled properly that is very, very important in the Chinese domestic political legitimacy context. I don't think that at this point, a Chinese leader who invades Taiwan, an amphibious landing, the geography is terrible for all of this, by the way. So even, I think that's part of the reason that people feel very uncertain that Beijing effectively take over Taiwan through military action, but ends up killing, millions of Taiwan people. And that would happen if this were successful. I'm not actually sure a Chinese leader could survive that in the Chinese political system. That is not the way the Chinese people want this issue resolved. And so I think that we have to consider that even though we can't understand and know intentions in any given moment, we can look at the culture, we can talk to people in China and really interrogate this idea that the only thing holding China back is the US, and therefore we must maintain this overwhelming military advantage. I'm not convinced. On semiconductors, chips, et cetera, the CHIPS Act, I think this is a US-China issue, right? Which is, again, Chinese system is very opaque. It is frustrating, I'm sure, for US policymakers to kind of understand how China marries together its economic, political, security strategies, what is legitimately part of China's development and economic competitiveness, what should be a security concern, even the TikTok ban. I think this all comes forward. We don't know how the Chinese system works. We don't know the limits of it, and therefore we cannot develop very precise policies for counteracting what we see as security concerns. But that just creates some China threat inflation. It means that sometimes, in those uncertainties, we tend to overstep and use blunt instruments for really, the scalpels or the chisels might be more necessary. So, I honestly think that the only way to resolve these problems, to resolve the information environment, is to try to have more and more deeper diplomacy with China, and not just with China, but also to go out to talk to our allies, partners, to countries around the world about what they're seeing and hearing from China as well. The Chinese system seems monolithic sometimes, particularly in the American media. It seems like Xi Jinping is in control, whatever he wants, he gets. He says Taiwan by 2027, that becomes a prediction. But anyone who's ever lived or worked in China or spent a lot of time with Chinese people understands that it is a system with politics, with dynamism, with different, center local relations. And that creates a very complex mix of policy pressures and interests that Xi Jinping has to accommodate or abide by or manage. And, to the extent that we can kind of put forward research, writing, analysis that speaks to some of those nuances, I think we can have a much better debate about where the US-China relationship should be, whether or not it's appropriate to do things like ban or force a sale of an app with Chinese ties. And, just ultimately have a better understanding of exactly where our security lines should be drawn so we can continue to enjoy what's been a very productive economic relationship with China without sacrificing our interests or values for our economic competitiveness.
Thank you very much for that. And again, thanks everybody for being here. In just a short amount of time, we're going to turn to your questions for our experts up here. But we're talking about modern missile systems and we're talking about semiconductors and TikTok and things of the moment. But I thought I'd end with a question before I turn it to you that turns back the clock a little bit. And, before it was a metaphor of Nixon going to China, it was an actual event, as we all know, and 52 years ago, which culminated 45 years ago in the official shift in recognition from Taipei to Beijing. And, at the time in the Cold War construct, of course, many then, and perhaps many since, considered it geostrategic genius in terms of the Nixon administration, Secretary Kissinger, who was invoked a little bit ago, partly because of the idea of dividing Moscow and Beijing. But of course, as we all know, particularly right now in the here and now, Moscow and Beijing have probably never been closer and increasingly close with Tehran and Pyongyang as well, and what is often euphemistically called an axis of authoritarianism. And so I want to have everyone comment, and we'll go in reverse order and start with you, Ivan, in a moment. Just how does that decision look 50 years hence?
So I obviously mentioned Kissinger. I think it was a great and, very innovative decision 50 years ago. And I think we're on a very good path. And as Mike mentioned, it was in the context of the Cold War. Whether we needed China on sides or not, so eventually, what happened through the 80s and the end of the Cold War is debatable, but I'm sure there is some contribution, right? How much is debatable? I think where the United States probably veered from the original intent, obviously, is then post-Cold War. And there have been a lot of sort of revisitations of how we've conducted our China policy and all that. The Trump administration, I have it here, in 2020 said the PRC's rapid economic development and increased engagement with the world did not lead to convergence with citizen-centric, free and open order as the United States had hoped. And then Kirk Campbell last year said, we're clear-eyed about the PRC. We know efforts to shape or reform China over several decades have failed. So this is, it's both. Everyone sort of looks back and goes, we made a gamble, it didn't work. There are a lot of questions now in Washington about whether admission to the WTO was smart. I think a lot of Congress thinks not now. And so I think that's, I guess the 50 years ago, I very much think, undeniably was a smart and very wise strategic move.
Thank you. Tom, please share your perspective.
So in the historical context, way back then, in the 1970s, involved the Vietnam War, which we were trying to get ourselves out of. It also involved the Sino-Soviet rift, which had taken place on its own terms as early as 1966. And in some ways, Mao took the initiative toward us in many respects. We responded immediately, saw the value of splitting Russia and China. This is, typical geopolitics. This is all this history. And Kissinger, being an expert on metronation and all these alliance building histories, was attuned to this. And it worked very well. Brzezinski, along with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, saw this as what really brought down the Soviet Union. Finally, was our alliance with China, plus their mistake going into Afghanistan. And maybe, I think Washington initially saw Putin making the same kind of mistake that the Soviets had made in Afghanistan. That this was a huge mistake of Russian policy. That's why we thought through sanctions, we could actually drive the result of this war, which turned out, of course, so far at least to be wrong. But in the current circumstance, I wonder sometimes how smart it is to be, in a sense, driving China and Russia together. Speaking to Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard wrote, potentially the most dangerous scenario the United States would be a creative coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran. An anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. And I think you can argue that for whatever reason, we haven't been able to reconcile with Iran for a lot of reasons we all know. And of course, Russia had been trying to get China to come on board since 2007 in a more unified policy against the US. And it's only fairly recently that China is more open to that. And you see this relationship deepen. As they say, it's beyond an alliance. The Chinese don't believe in alliance. They believe in alliance. Problematic. But on hunts, yes. Geoeconomic groupings, yes. So anyway, I personally think that we have agency in what's happening right now in the alliance, the coalitions that you just described, and we should rethink some things.
Thank you very much. Mike, please.
John, I'm gonna do 4 really quick Kissinger stories. And at least 2 of them have some substance, but I'll be very fast because I'm not the only, right, I'm not the only one here who knew him, but the last 3 years or so, I got to know him well on the Defense Policy Board, and it was a treat. It's like, you know, living history. I mean, I was waiting for Abraham Lincoln to join the policy board. And so I visited him in his office in New York last spring. Don't worry, I'm not going to do a whole lot of Kissinger accents, but after we were talking for a while and he would fade out and then he'd wake back up. But he said to me after a certain point, he said, you would have done well in the Nixon White House. I wasn't really sure how to take that. He had this mischievous thing in his eye, and he knew he was sort of teasing me as he said it. Then, as you know, he went to China last summer at age 100. We had a birthday cake for him in the June meeting of the Defense Policy Board because he turned 100, I think, in May. And then he went to China in July. And they served him the same lunch menu they had served him in 1971. And he was recounting all these stories to us, and we're having the meeting. And then Secretary Austin walks in for our 1 hour we get to spend with him in a 2-day meeting. And normally when Austin walks in, like for any Secretary of Defense, but especially Austin, because he's so imposing, such a big, you know, beautiful baritone guy, you stand up and practically salute. But in this case, we all stayed focused on Kissinger. We're like, Mr. Secretary, can you just wait a second? We'll talk to you soon. But the other 2 points, which I think appear in Kissinger's writings, and so I don't think I'm betraying confidence. Once I was making the same point at a meeting that Ivan just made, which is we have to worry first and foremost about preventing the invasion scenario from playing out, because that's the one that can happen faster than our response time, et cetera. And it's the greatest, you know, it's the worst outcome if it is successful. And I made this point, and then Kissinger looks at me, and I won't do the imitation this time, but he said, yeah, but you know, they think the time is on their side in a long war. And so even if we stop the short-term threat, they may then transition to the longer-term blockade. And I said to the board, come on, who are you going to believe on China, Kissinger or O'Hanlon? And Kissinger appreciated that kind of humor, even when he was 100 years old and some upstart Brookings woolly-headed liberal is talking that way to him. And then the last point I'll make, and you can decide if this is useful or not as an answer to your question, John, but he was telling us about his conversations with Mao and Deng Xiaoping about why China fought India in 1962 and Vietnam in 1979. And it gets a little bit to Rory's point about how would they want to fight Taiwan. And basically Kissinger said, why did you invade India and then pull back and you lose people and you gain no territory when you had the upper hand? And Mao said to Kissinger, because we weren't interested in territory, we were interested in messing with the Indians psychologically. And then the same thing, he asked Deng Xiaoping, and in that war, the Chinese lost, I think, tens of thousands of casualties. And then they pulled back after taking a lot of Vietnamese land. And Kissinger said, what were you thinking? And Deng Xiaoping gave the same answer. We wanted Vietnam, we wanted to get in their heads. So they couldn't go and be mini hegemons around Southeast Asia. They'd have to worry about us. And then we could dominate the broader region. So we were not interested in their land. We were interested in their thinking. And he was implying that would be the way that China would most likely think about using force against Taiwan, primarily to create a psychological or political effect, as opposed to directly achieve a military.
Sounds like Israel.
Yeah, I mean.
Interesting. Thank you very much. An answer was anecdotes. And Rory, please.
I think that the policy of opening up to China has been incredibly successful. Obviously, you know, you can't kind of argue the negative, what would have happened if we didn't do this, if China hadn't entered the WTO, et cetera. It's really difficult to scenario plan for things that didn't happen. So I'm gonna totally punt this question, tell my own Kissinger story. Of which I have a couple, but the one relevant here is that I had the opportunity to bring Kissinger into a US-China track 2 dialogue with a group of emerging leaders. And he was always a professorial in some ways with young people and took some time to answer their questions. And this was back in like 2013, 2014, probably. And someone asked, like, I really want to be an effective policymaker in US-China relations. Like, what should I focus on? What should I study? And he gave, I think, one of the most brilliant answers I've ever heard, which is, he said, you should go read Chinese classical novels, learn the language, know the culture and the history. You are young, and by the time that you get to make any decisions about US-China policy, the issues of the day, at this point, currency manipulation is what we were talking about, that old gem, will have moved on. But the history and the culture is thousands of years old, so don't worry about that. It's not going to change so quickly. You'll still have an opportunity to use it in order to do the art of diplomacy, which is really persuading people to see things from your point of view. You know, I just think that is like a really wonderful way for me to remember the small amount of time that I got to spend with Henry Kissinger and to pass on to students at the University of Minnesota.
That's terrific. Thank you very much for that. And for those students, and we're all students of what's going on in the world. Now it's your time to ask questions, and for everyone and anyone to feel free to jump in. And if you want to direct the question to any of the 4 individuals, please feel free to do that, or just ask your question and make sure that everyone gets a chance among some of the questions to provide some responses. So please, I see a hand right back there, please.
I think Roy touched on it more than the rest of you about the domestic political issues driving international relations. I mean, in my oral defense of my master's 24 years ago, that was my argument, that we weren't going to end up in a war because of China's real estate problems, economic problems, social unrest would all keep them away from us. I don't know what you all think about that, how those factors drive international relations, rather than international relations themselves.
Well, Tom, I know you wanted to say something on this, just quick, Rory, I know you mentioned, you know, your comment. Do you have any thoughts? And then we'll pass it down to Tom here as well.
Yeah, I think it's just instructive to remember that China is like America, organized around a lot of competing interest groups. They change, they ebb and flow over time, and the party's job is to kind of manage those interests. So, you know, where this becomes, I think, most salient in terms of foreign policy debate, perhaps on Taiwan, is that there are some people who argue that if China's domestic political economy is going poorly, China is more likely to try to make big moves on Taiwan or in the international system in order to distract the public from problems at home. I would argue against that. I would say that China, you know, the Chinese Communist Party's greatest sense of impending threat is its own people. You know, also its greatest responsibility is to its domestic political economy. And that's how the party sees it. And so I find that China becomes more, let's say, aggressive in international affairs when it feels like it has a very firm political base of support at home. And that in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years, it's going to be very difficult for them to find that base of support, because you simply can't, in my opinion, I think China will have difficulty navigating what it sees as its security policy with a functional economic policy. The movement of the party into the private sector and into people's lives has not endeared Chinese people to that party control. And I think managing that relationship will be a full-time job plus for the coming years. And that's part of the reason we don't see China taking very aggressive moves around Taiwan unless provoked as such by Nancy Pelosi's visit or other incidents.
Thank you very much. Tom, please.
I was gonna actually make the same point that Roy just made there, but I would extrapolate a bit. If you sort of look at the shifting arguments, and you see an interesting fellow to follow is a kind of a rising star named Hal Brands, who's at Johns Hopkins Science, who's prolific, is the word one could use. Anyway, not long ago, a couple of years ago, he co-wrote an article with Jake Sullivan. That was titled China's two-pronged strategy to world domination. So that was the result of the road going towards Eurasia and what they were doing in the Asian area. That their intent was global domination, and of course that's in our national security strategy too. The idea that they have the wherewithal and the intent to change the world. But totally how Rankin was arguing with what Roy said, that it's China's weakness that makes it aggressive and that may cause it to attack Taiwan. Sort of peak China, which is sort of an end idea. So the common denominator is that China is perceived as aggressive. That's and the grounds for that can shift very dramatically. I think that the domestic situation in China has got the leadership there with its hands full. I think that it, our own people like Jake Sullivan are admitting that we're really overstretched right now with what we're doing. I think the same is true for China. And I think that's why they agreed to sort of tamp things down in San Francisco, where positive gestures were made on things like fentanyl, military contacts, climate. There's more dialogue. I think it's partly because the Chinese have got their hands full at home. So I would kind of argue the opposite of what my friends.
Thank you. Ivan, please.
So I'm not as smart as Hal Brands or any of these other people, Ryan and others. But I think it's important that any of these things could happen. And the fact that we don't know is really important. And I didn't mean to imply, Rory might have mentioned that like China would have invaded Taiwan in the last 40 years if it could have. What I implied, if it had wanted to, for some reason, it provoked or whatever, I believe it's the military asymmetry that has stopped that and not China policy or whatever political agreement we think we have. We've seen China obviously violate tons of political agreements, Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I do want to just go back to, let's say, I believe, or whoever, that there's a 5% chance, given all these other dynamics and how this plays out, that by 2030, China's going to invade Taiwan. Let's say it's 3%. I still think we need to do the military asymmetry thing because the costs are so high of that war to the world that even if it's 5%, 3%, that is the number one. So we need to buy that down to as low as possible, to zero, which means he looks and goes, oh no, I don't want to mess with it. So that's where I'm not saying he's gonna attack, but that is the worst possible scenario. I think we all agree on that. And we have to make it, and I'm not gonna count on, hey, we had a handshake and we had a political agreement, so I think we're okay. You know what I mean? It's just not good enough for me.
Michael, you wrote in your analysis that a war between, and I think you mentioned here today, the US and China must never be fought because of this catastrophic aspect. So other questions, please. Yes,
Hi.
please. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just respond to a word, hegemon, from Tom earlier. He said that. Recently, not just recently, I heard from many times, Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia describe America as a hegemon. And some people may not know what the word means, and I don't want to go in detail. From my point of view, what it means is that we're the master of the universe. We can move pieces to our liking. And we have been able to, we have the might to do it, and even our value of our country for quite some time. And, okay, so if you agree that we're the hegemon, you have to answer the question, at what cost to ourselves? At what cost to other countries who happen to be in our way? And I have one example, and you cannot deny that, all. Okay, because United States have been successfully prevented China, who had a revolution, you can call it civil war, okay, in 1949. We're talking about 75 years. United States has successfully prevented China from attain territorial integrity and to have a closure to revolution. It's never happened before, not our own revolution and not French Revolution. But we as a hegemon, so successful, prevented China for 75 years to achieve that. And even here today, we are in our really goodwill, sit down and talk. These are tactics. It's still following that strategy, preventing another country who achieved, okay, who's successful in a revolution. We successfully prevented China and 1.6 billion people to have the aspiration. You answer that question.
Would anyone like to answer?
Anybody want to first? Okay.
I do think we've been partly successful, although there's been good nuanced discussion about how other factors have played a big role besides whatever American policy or capabilities have been around. I would also point out, though, a paradox. This is going to go beyond your point, which was well said, and I'm glad you made it. But I'm just going to, as I wrote this book on military history during COVID shutdown, I was struck by something about the last 80 years of US grand strategy, which is that we haven't done very well in the battlefield. But we have had the most successful grand strategy of any great power in history over that exact same time period. Because we have helped protect our core allies and the international commons. You know, think about Taiwan, not just as an island, but an island 100 miles across water. And that water, as Rory said earlier, is really important for the way the world economy works. We've been good at protecting core allies and the international commons, even though we haven't done so well in actual interventions. And I'm certainly not blaming the military. I'm blaming the way the political system has made choices about what, when, and how to fight. So we lost in Vietnam, we lost in Afghanistan. We sort of fought to a stalemate in Korea, and it's too soon to tell in Iraq. So that's, by my accounting, 0, 2, and 2 in our big wars since 1945. But the world has never been, despite all the problems, more democratic, more stable among great powers, or more prosperous. And that's partly because of US grand strategy. So that's the observation I would make.
Tom, please.
I think an element of US grand strategy coming out of World War II and what is still today is to prevent the rise of what we call a peer competitor or a hegemon, especially on either side of Eurasia. I mean, you may know better than I whether that is still kind of a underlying reflex. I spoke not that long ago with a very, very retired, but recently retired, very high military official who said, yes, absolutely, that is still. I think the idea is we have a blessed geography here, right? We control our region, and we don't want anyone else to have that opportunity, because this is what allows us to project beyond our region. We're afraid that now whether that mentality still persists, whether it's still adaptive, I don't know. Do you see much actual discussion of that in the military?
I think that's, again, almost assumed when you talk about military people. They sort of have this, I was raised 30 years ago when I joined the military, because US is out there protecting the global commons, like that's, preserving the world order, and that was sort of the post-Cold War accepted view. Obviously, we sort of ignored the fact that there are a lot of folks out there that maybe didn't accept that view. And that's what we're seeing more and more of now. I think it's, that's where we are. I think right now, when you read US strategy, right, it's, and I'll get the exact wording wrong, but I think the current administration describes China as the only country with the intent and increasingly the capability, right, militarily, economically, diplomatically, to challenge and revise basically the world order, and that obviously means that's something we don't want. So that's an explicit, part of our strategy now, is that we don't welcome, China's version of the world, and, should we or should we not, I won't weigh in on that here. But clearly your strategy feels that that's not good for America, Americans, and I think that's bipartisan.
I think we have time for one more quick question and quick answer, and I just saw a gentleman hand up there first, so please.
Hi, Raymond Kuo, I'm the Taiwan director of the Rand Corporation. So I disagree with three of you, not either. Because you're making the assumption that we are in a security dilemma. But in 1976, Bob Jervis wrote that, look, you are only in a security dilemma if all the parties are defensively oriented and actually want to preserve the status quo. So we can kind of debate whether or not that's actually true in say, the United States and China's case, but probably not the case when it comes to China and Taiwan. And in that sort of situation, you're not in a spiral model, you're in a deterrence model, because when you give assurances, for example, to a revisionist state, it only emboldens them. Instead, Bob was, I think, pretty clear on this, you have to actually increase the credibility of your threats. And so this is where Ivan, I think I agree, you want to increase the amount of military power you have, because if you just say, we're going to find some sort of political solution, you actually, embolden the Chinese to want to take over Taiwan. So the question I have is this. The foundational assumption for your arguments, for three of your arguments, is that we are in a security. What do you propose if that foundational assumption is wrong?
I'll start because I don't think I used the term, although your point was well made. But I don't frame the China-Taiwan relationship fundamentally as one of a security dilemma. But I think it's important to recognize that if we disrupt the current trajectory too abruptly, then China may decide that its patience can't necessarily be sustained either. So I don't put things all in just Jervis was great, and I'm glad you invoked him. And we all miss him dearly too. We're lucky enough to know him. And but the world doesn't boil down just to spiral model and deterrence model. This is a more complicated relationship. There are elements of both. I would support a lot of the elements of military improvement in US capabilities that I think Ivan also supports, and his administration under Secretary Mattis and the Biden administration under Secretary Austin are pursuing, especially making sure that China cannot take Taiwan quickly, and making sure that we don't have vulnerabilities that would leave us unable to help respond. So in that part, I'm glad you gave me the chance to make that point.
Well, Tom and Rory, I know Raymond, by inference mentioned you. Would you like to weigh in before we wrap up here on that? Either or both of you, please. Thank you.
I'll give careful consideration to the question over time. I think when it comes to the status quo, I might slightly disagree that all sides don't want to keep it. I actually think they do in the short term, until the other conditions are favorable for a long-term resolution, right? So I think Beijing's been pretty clear that it wants the status quo. How we define the status quo among all three sides does differ. I think, for Beijing's perspective, it's really important that the status quo is dynamic and it's leading toward unification. The US and Taiwan would be totally comfortable with the status quo. So, de facto permanent separation would be totally fine. But I don't know. I think that as Michael said, there are elements of a security dilemma at play here, particularly when it comes to actions actually taken. So from my perspective, I've not seen a pattern of events, and I'd love to talk to you if you disagree, in which political reassurances have led to emboldenment. I'm not seeing that. What I'm seeing is that, political reassurances tend to calm things down, and what has led to action are political decisions that have created anxieties that a red line would be crossed. In Beijing's case, a red line is a formal declaration of independence from Taiwan. In Taiwan's case, I think the red line is the use of force or coercion. And I think the US has something kind of in between that. So, so it's just not the pattern that I'm observing, but I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Tom, we're gonna finish with you.
Yeah. But that's an excellent point, Raymond. I take your point. As was pointed out, Rory pointed out, I mean, we're dealing with a very different civilization here. I mean, you know, the last time there was a hegemonic transition in the 1930s between the US and the UK, as we assumed the global commons from them, very much in the same cultural sphere. This is very different. And so to say that this is not a security dilemma, I'm not going to go there because it seems very complex. And I'm not sure that you're correct in wondering that. So I guess I find myself going back to next week. And the idea that you realize it's a Kantian world and you develop your policies based on the goal you have in mind. And for me, that is peace in the Taiwan Strait, an eventual peaceful resolution of this conflict, and avoiding any risk-taking that could emerge from other approaches. So, but I think your point is an important one and that to be discussed.
Well, I think ending on a peaceful resolution in the Taiwan conflict is great. It's something we could all agree on. I want to thank Dr. Charles. I want to thank everyone from Brookings and from the China Center. I especially want to thank all of you for your engagement in this issue, for being so flexible and so motivated to come here today. Apologies to those of you who I couldn't get to in terms of questions. Perhaps our panelists will have a moment or two afterwards, but I particularly want to thank our panelists and give them a big round of applause.